Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and I'm joined by my fellow podcast host, Alfie Kohn. Thank you, Alfie.
My pleasure.
So, we are here today, of course, to talk about education and what's wrong with education and AI and everything. But really, the reason why I asked you on the show was so you could tell my listeners about your new podcast. So tell them about the show, Alfie.
Well, that's a wonderful opportunity. I appreciate your inviting me to do this bit of self promotion. Yes, I learned about podcasts relatively recently. I've been joking. I just heard about it. On my website, I mentioned that all of my writings about education and parenting and human behavior have one thing in common, which is that these essays are extremely inconvenient to read while you're driving or cooking dinner. And so I decided to start a podcast called Kohn's Zone, which deals mostly with education, but some larger issues of human behavior as well. Most of them are short episodes where I hold forth on various topics that overlap with some of the writings I've done over the years. And every fourth episode or so is a longer conversation in which I interview someone in the field of education. I started in the summer, and I'm pleased at how it's going.
Good. I mean, I should say I've been really enjoying it. I've added it to my my podcast rotation. Although, my wife has asked that I stop listening to it because I get so frustrated when I listen to the podcast, and then especially dealing with we have two kids in elementary school, and I'll
Yeah.
listen to your podcast about what's wrong with education, and I agree with it, and then my kids come home with just literally everything. You'll say on Cone Zone, your children shouldn't be doing worksheets. And then my kids will bring me 50 worksheets and they say, look what I did.
Yeah.
Isn't this great? And I'm like, no, it's terrible. It's horrible. And I
If
hate your school. That's not an appropriate thing to say to my 6-year-old. So I don't say it, but it's what I'm thinking.
Well, if you think it's frustrating to compare your kids' school experiences with what you've heard me say, imagine what it's like to compare your school experiences with being me. I, I mean, I have two kids, and I watch them. My ex-father-in-law once said the hardest job in America would be to be Alfie Kohn's kids' teacher. I tried to be diplomatic, but I'm critical of schools for a living.
Yeah, no, and I I appreciate that. I appreciate that you do it, and this has led to me something that I've spoken about on this podcast a few times is how I have very very negative feelings towards teachers in general, which is of course a horrible thing to feel. There's nothing better than teachers, and it seems like we have this like I don't know, like I have a dichotomous relationship with teachers. There's nothing better than someone who will help and shepherd and cherish and nurture young minds. And then your average teacher, however they feel, and my guess would be your average teacher wants nothing more than to nurture and cherish young minds. They are also at the front lines of indoctrinating children into everything we don't like about the world and bureaucracy and hierarchy and competition. And so I feel like what could be better than a teacher and what could be worse than a teacher? I don't know. How do you reconcile these feelings? Or at least I'm curious because I don't know how to reconcile them.
Well, let's distinguish between the people who are doing the job of teaching and the role of teacher and the
Hmm.
way that it's set out for them, first of all. The individuals are often caught up in the same system and victims in the
Yeah.
same way that students are of systemic pressures of many kinds. They have a gun to their head, especially in the The fad that has not lost its grip on our schools of accountability, the pressure to raise the bar, which means raise test scores. And there is pressure on teachers to do that in the same way that there is pressure on the kids. And not only that, but there is also a lack of autonomy on the part of
Hmm.
teachers in the way that this is true of kids, where huge swaths of the curriculum are dictated to teachers, so they don't have the capacity to create the space, the latitude to create lessons that respond to the questions that kids have about the world when they are compelled to do rocks and minerals, in fourth grade, and to do it in a particular way. So it's not just a matter of the pressure on teachers to produce a certain level of competence, which is often just about memorizing facts, not thinking deeply, but it's that the very subject matter is something that they experience coercion about. I mean, I would like to see more teachers bring students into the process of co-creating a curriculum and doing a lot more asking and a lot less telling. But teachers have to have the autonomy to run the classroom and design the lessons as they see fit in order to give it away. And they often don't. And merit pay is often used to try to enforce the pressure to raise test scores. I mean, when I started out some decades ago with an interest in social change and also in human behavior, I ended up gravitating, after writing a few books, toward the field of education precisely because classrooms are a place where we can make enormous change, where we can, I had written a book about the destructiveness of competition, and I thought, where better to help raise a generation skilled at and committed to the idea of cooperation instead, working together instead of working against each other. And then I wrote a book about altruism and empathy, and I started thinking the same thing. What is an institution where we can help a generation act on their capacity to care? And I had been a teacher before, but I had sort of moved away from that in writing and thinking and lecturing about grand topics like altruism and competition, and then thought, school is the place to make change. And so I got pulled back in. And so, for better and for worse, teaching is an occupation where one can have an entry point in a truly unique way into the kind of society we have.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all that. I do often find, though, that you end up with the sort of snake eating its tail. Like the teaching is bad, not because there's something wrong with the people doing the teaching, but because of the systems they are in. But the people who designed those systems were taught in that same system when they were younger, and now they're enforcing it. And where do you where since it's a self-reproducing cycle, it seems like school is a great place to intervene. But when you try and intervene in schools, you've got policymakers or academics, people outside of schools who say, "Oh, well, this intervention is not acceptable." And I don't know, it becomes this chicken and egg thing, and I end up I go back and forth between thinking schools are a good place to intervene or the intervention has to happen somewhere else because those other places are what dictate what the schools are like.
Right. That's true, and it's not mutually exclusive. There are many points of entry in trying to make social change, and there are many points of entry even when your goal is to make change with education. And, I have, over my career, I have worked with many, many teachers and principals. I've spoken at conferences of administrators in the central office of each district. I have also spoken, once I was even invited to speak in the National Association of State Boards of Education. That person who hired me there is quickly had another job, I think. But, wherever I speak, as I've spoken to school boards and even sometimes to state legislators, and everybody with some justification is able to point the finger and say, I can't really make these decisions. It's really amazing. You think of it as just, wherever you are on the food chain of American education, I think you have an obligation to be a buffer, which is to say to absorb pressure from above rather than passing it on to those below. Otherwise, you become a conduit. You become the accomplice of people higher up on the chain who may know less about children and learning than you do. And so your goal, without being fired, is to accept that pressure and maximize the autonomy of the people who report to you. If you're on the school board, your job is to protect the superintendent. The superintendent's job is to protect the principal to protect the teachers, and the teachers the kids. But as you move up, you realize that these people, the people on the school board say we're helpless in the face of the pressure from the state legislature and the newspaper and the parents who show up demanding that we ban the books or raise the scores or whatever agenda is getting in the way of meaningful learning at the moment. And but I just happen to know education in this way, but there's probably parallel things going on with respect to the hierarchies and the top-down control apparatuses in all kinds of fields.
I'm sure that's correct. I'm sure that's true.
But it's also the case that at various points, many people, and this is something under the Trump regime that we're really discovering anew, is the extent to which people give in and give up and obey prematurely and self-censor before somebody else has a chance to censor them. And boy, have I seen a lot of that over the years, where there's often a surprising degree of room in the interstices, where even a teacher who's being monitored carefully can do all sorts of things and get away with various forms of constructive subversion, and doesn't, either be often just out of fear. I remember once there's this videotape that shows an extraordinary fourth grade teacher who brings the kids in on designing the science curriculum and has them think about what they want to learn next. And they choose different things, and so then she has them figure out together, how do we decide which of these ideas we should spend time on? And the kids immediately say, we should vote. And she helps them understand that voting is, as I like to put it, adversarial majoritarianism, where it's not about seeing the perspectives of other people. It's not about finding a compromise. It's not about hashing out a consensus. It's just about whoever has the most votes wins, and the other people don't get to do what they want. And it's amazing the way they work this out and come to a consensus and learn about the topic, which happens to be, in this case, the solar system, that's so much richer and deeper than 98% of other classrooms, where you just turn to the next chapter in the textbook or the next lesson plan and you do whatever the hell you're told. And I showed that videotape to teachers all over the place and asked for their responses. And more than once, a teacher has said, "Boy, I'd like to work in that district," where where she has the power to be able to do something like that. And both times a teacher said that in two different states, somebody else in the room shyly raised a hand and said, "I work in your district and my classroom looks a lot like that." And
Yeah,
I
yeah, go
don't
ahead.
want to, lose sight of the enormous pressures that teachers are under. But at the same time, there is often more capacity and you have to do it by swimming upstream. There's pressure on you. But often, somebody may say, you got to teach something on this topic, or you have to turn in grades even though you don't like grades, but nobody says that you have to decide on the grades unilaterally rather than having the kids decide on their own grades. They may say you got to teach this, but they don't say you can't have democratic class meetings. They don't say that you can't get rid of homework, or that you can use authentic assessments instead of tests. So there's often the capacity that many teachers don't even realize they have, if they are shown, if they are coached, if they are helped to realize that there's a world of possibilities out there that look nothing like traditional education of the kind to which they were subjected as children.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. I also just say, speaking from personal experience, you can also do it and try and be subversive and get caught and suffer severe uh professional consequences. And when I did this, this was during the COVID. What I said, I actually got caught on tape because, of course, they were recording our classes in case students were absent, telling the students more or less what you said about buffering. I said, things are hard now, and the administration has told us we're not allowed to alter anything in terms of how we're teaching you, and the rigor has to stay the same. But I'm going to do my best to provide a buffer for you, and that outraged them. But the thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of the story was while I was being observed in this punitive improvement plan process I was in, I ran my class in this democratic way, and I got observed one day where all we talked about was what the students wanted to learn. I had what I had to teach them, American culture, over this like 50-year period, but we discussed how it was going to be and we worked through it and we developed a plan. And I, just thought at the end of it, this was amazing, and these administrators will just see how well this works. And I received an email from the administrator who observed my classroom like an hour later and was like, "Thank you for having me in that discussion. It was very pleasant, but I'm going to need to come back at a time when you're actually teaching the students
Yeah,
something."
right. Right. I've heard this before from teachers. I want to come back when you're teaching. To which the appropriate response is, "Do you mean come back when I'm lecturing and less
Yes.
learning is going on? I can stage that for you if you want me to take a break from meaningful learning of the kind you're seeing today." That would be my snappy retort here. But it's a teachable moment for the administrator, for the teacher to teach the administrator to realize that what you're thinking of as teaching that may lend itself to evaluation and monitoring and surveillance is not the best use of a teacher's time. Because, learning comes more from kids talking than listening. We have an enormous amount of research to that effect. And there are some administrators who've never been invited to think about that before, and great teachers can help them do that, rather than just submit to silently the idea that, "Oh, okay, I'll be happy to do what you want." I mean, more broadly here, I think teachers, like the rest of us, have to work on two tracks at once when we face a challenging system. we have to, in the short run, minimize the damage of the structure that we're in by doing as much great stuff as we can get away with and smoothing out the bumps and the hard stuff for the kids to, minimize the damaging effects of grades and tests and homework and traditional discipline systems and so on. But at the same time, we have to be organizing and mobilizing to change the system rather than assuming that, high-stakes testing or the use of homework or, kids having to raise their hands and wait to be called on so one person in the room decides at all times who gets to speak, or whatever it is we're talking about here, whatever aspect of traditional education. This is not like the weather. This is not a fact of life to which one must accommodate oneself. These are political decisions. These are policies that human beings enacted and then other human beings signed off on and perpetuated. So our job is not to do just one of those, but to do both of those, to organize other people to change the rules, and at the same time to, in the meantime, as a stopgap measure, soften the destructive blow of the rules until we can get them changed.
Yeah, again, I'm in complete agreement. Although, again, as someone who is in a state where public sector unions are illegal, there are not just barriers to doing, to doing the good kind of teaching. There's barriers to political organizing. You can get fired for what you tweet about Charlie Kirk, and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sort of thing. Very briefly discussed the killing of Charlie Kirk in my classroom, as I very briefly discussed the October 7th attacks in Israel a couple of years ago, because I want to provide this space for my students to be able to talk about these things. But also, I professors get fired for what they have said to their students, so it's
Well, yes,
nerve-wracking.
it is nerve-wracking, but you shifted the conversation a bit here to political issues in the broader sense there. And obviously, I deplore that kind of censorship. But we were talking a moment ago about what teachers can get away with in terms of the way they run their classrooms. And even there, in some of the more reactionary parts of the country, there's pressure not to stray too far. But that's not the same thing. And we can have some impact as well. The idea that we should, that what you post on Facebook about world events can get you fired is terrible.
Yeah.
But, to point to that and say we live in a reactionary country and we're going through a profoundly anti-democratic phase of our history right now is true, but that's not a reason why we can't, ungrade classrooms. It's not a reason why we can't bring kids in on planning the curriculum and deciding together how we want our classrooms to be, rather than using traditional bribes and threats in order to elicit mindless obedience. Even in a reactionary age, even during the triumph of people with totalitarian sensibilities, there's a difference that we can make within the classroom that is quietly subversive, not just empowering for kids, but it's challenging implicitly the idea of top-down control and offering a model for democracy in everyday life. Well, on one of the episodes, the one that I posted recently of my new podcast, I had a conversation with with someone who has been thinking very carefully about issues of education for some time, Joel Westheimer, who's at the University of Ottawa. And Joel has this interesting thought experiment where he asks us to imagine that you find yourself magically transported to a classroom somewhere in the world. You don't know what country you're in. And asks, by watching what goes on in the classroom and the way the classroom is managed, can you guess whether you're in a democratic as opposed to a totalitarian country? And it's a really interesting thought experiment because of the extent to which, we're even in a country we think of as democratic, even in the United States, in a pre-Trumpian age, for example, everybody starts the day by reciting a loyalty oath to the fatherland,
It's not
and
good.
and you have to, you have to wait to be called on, and you have no say about what's going on, even if you're in high school. I like to say that the average American high school is excellent preparation for the real world if you're going to be living in North Korea. So then turn this on its head and ask, how in any country can we create something where a visitor would guess you live in a democracy? Even if it's more aspirational.
Aspirational, yes. So I take your point that something like someone getting fired for a Twitter post is a bit is a related but a separate issue in terms of how we run the classrooms. But there is this thing that I do want to make sure I mention because people have there was an instructor at I think Texas Tech who lost her job recently because she taught gender in a class on children's literature.
Yeah.
And there's a totalitarianism of the learning objectives of the KPIs, and they can sneak in their political censorship and their bans on organizing by simply saying, well, on, September of this day, you taught this thing, and you're required to teach this other thing, and therefore you've demonstrated bad teaching. So there's this way that the kind of teaching that you're talking about that I value can be blocked, not just, in the name of totalitarianism, but in the name of learning or excellence or metrics or whatever you want to say. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. You have conversations, let's say, with people who you feel like you broadly agree with, and then at the end they say, but of course we do need to have some sort of way that we're measuring to make sure that these schools are good and these teachers are good. And the idea that the measurement itself is the thing that prevents education from being effective so horrifies these, otherwise progressive people that can be a conversation ender for me.
And yet it can be a conversation beginner. It can initiate something because many of those people have never thought about that before. I mean, when we're talking about the Trump regime trying to snuff out any kind of emphasis on diversity and inclusion and so on, and who frankly have a theocratic agenda, which we're seeing in many red states. Yes, that's horrible. But there's, just like I have to believe, a great number of people who voted for Trump were not voting for terrorizing peaceful families earning a living with masked Gestapo. And a lot of people who voted for Trump were not looking for tariffs, or we could go on.
Yeah.
And you're not going to reach the dedicated MAGA folks. No argument will persuade them, because it was not reason or anything or the best of their humanity that led them to that position. But the same thing is true with respect to education. Like, a number of people who will say to me, what you just indicated, you've heard, we've got to, we have to have some way to hold schools accountable and to measure, right?
Mm.
Don't we need standardized testing? I'm going to take that question literally. And I'm going to address that and say, we need to assess the quality of schools. But if you've reduced that to numbers, if you're talking about measurement, you have already eliminated some of the most important aspects of learning that cannot be quantified. Now instead of asking, how should we get to the park today, you're asking, whose car will we take, yours or mine? You have excluded walking and public transit and bicycles by the way you framed the question. And a great number of well-intentioned, thoughtful people in the world of education, as well as parents and legislators, have literally never had anyone say that to them. They've never looked into not only how standardized tests measure what matters least, intellectually speaking, but how the broader category of measurement means that we are no longer attending to what Eleanor Duckworth calls the having of wonderful ideas, because it's a lot easier to quantify and test the number of times a student has used a semicolon correctly than the number of wonderful ideas she's had. So the more you're focused on measurement, the worse your classrooms become. And I guess my broader point here is it's not a conversation ender here. It's an opportunity to not only tweak around the edges how many times we give standardized tests or how quickly we release the results, or whether we're using the worst kind of tests, which are norm referenced and multiple choice and given to children when they're too young and all of those things. But taking a step back to ask a broader question about what do we care about? What's the purpose of education? And what kind of assessments get in the way? So that even if you have a high score on a standardized test, it may be a worrisome sign. A lot of people, I believe, and I don't see myself as an unduly optimistic person, but a lot of people who are well-intentioned can be persuaded to rethink those silent assumptions, those hidden premises. And what's true of assessment, which is what we've just been talking about, is true of many other features too. A great number of people don't realize that no study has ever found any benefit to any kind of homework below the high school level. So they simply assumed it has to be given, but it's literally all pain and no gain. And so I'm not going to persuade the people who are have an ideological commitment to making kids work a second shift when they get home, whether it does them any good or not. I'm going to address the people who reasonably believed that this was best practice, and it turns out that it's not supported. And the same thing is true. We could go on with other things as well, that lots and lots of people believe that punishments are bad, but rewards are good. And it turns out that rewards are just sugar-coated control, and they turn out to be not merely ineffective, but counterproductive in precisely the same way that punishments are. So I spend my time going after the persuadable.
Yeah, and I just have to say from my own experience, my kids bring homework home and I say, you don't need to do that homework. And they say, I do have to do the homework so I get the reward. So that's a twofer. That's a twofer right
Yeah.
there. The last thing I want to say, Alfie, as our time is drawing to a close, is, I'm very concerned about the use of AI in the classroom. I loved your recent podcast and newsletter about this, and I do think I'll give you the last word on this. It is if the goal is to, produce something that can be measured, then AI seems to make sense to people because if students can learn how to get the AI to produce the right thing, which as you and I both know, it's unlikely the AI will produce the right thing, but then that product it seems like, oh, we should train students to that, and that's preparation for the real world. But if you're actually trying to get students to have wonderful ideas, to think, to learn, to experience, AI is it's antithetical. It's the forklift in the gym. If you've learned how to get AI to write your papers, it's not that you've taken another route. It's you've gone to not that you've taken another route to the same place. You've gone in the opposite direction. And watching the embrace of AI by people who I think should know better, as well as the people who obviously should not know better, has been disheartening. And I just want to thank you for that recent post and podcast.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I hope your listeners either listen to that or read the much longer piece, which it's stuffed with dozens of links to essays by other people and research on the topic, where you could go down this rabbit hole for a long time. Um, yeah, I mean, look, it shouldn't be an English teacher or a math teacher's job to teach kids how to use AI just because some workplace has given in to big tech and is going to be doing it too, with the eventual goal of of throwing these people out of work, not helping them do their work better, by the way. But AI doesn't help kids to think carefully. It doesn't help kids to read deeply, to express their thoughts clearly. It teaches you how to avoid doing these things.
Yeah,
But
that's
and so the teacher is being pressured in many cases to use a technique that's it's sort of inimical to his or her purported objective of helping kids to become better thinkers. But as I think you were hinting at the beginning of your question, the way I put it is that AI makes sense if you think that learning is a series of products that are extruded rather than a process. If the goal is just to churn out a certain number of words in an essay, or extract bullet points from somebody else's written work, then yeah, AI can help you do it faster. A lot of errors, so it needs constant fact checking, but it can be done with less friction. AI is attractive to people who regard education as nothing more than a route to acquiring a credential.
Hmm.
The people who want nothing to do with AI in school are the people who see education as a process where reading is valuable in its own right and writing is about thinking. So it's almost like a diagnostic. You tell you. I hadn't put it quite this way before, but you tell me somebody's attitude about AI in schools, and I will tell you that person's view of education itself. And the people receptive to AI have what I regard as a truly troubling view of why people are in schools in the first place.
Oh, that is fantastic, Alfie. That is just fantastic. Let's end there. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And then, anything else you want to tell people about what you're up to? I mean, why not plug the podcast one more time and anything else you want to say, and then
Yeah.
we can go.
No, thanks. I've reached the level of the limit of plugging comfort.
Self-promotion.
But it's yes, exactly. But it's very kind of you to let people know about this. And my podcast is available the same place that my written work is available, which is on. Yeah, you can listen to it on the big tech stuff like Spotify and Apple if you want, but you can also listen to it as well as read my writings on my own website, which is just my name, Alfie Kohn with a K.org.
All right. All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you again, Alfie.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.